Ava Martinez stood on the narrow, vibrating catwalk, her fingers trembling as she clutched a leather maintenance log soaked in arterial blood. Below her, the massive industrial grinders roared like a hungry beast. But the sound was drowned out by the click of a dozen safety catches being disengaged. Miller stood 10 feet away, a twisted smile on his face as he held up a grainy, doctored photo of Eva's 6-year-old daughter. "One step closer, and she's in the system forever, Eva," he shouted over the mechanical shriek. "Give me the book, or you lose everything." As the security guards closed in, Eva looked down at her hands, bruised, grease-stained, and empty of the phone that held her only digital proof. She was cornered, stripped of her evidence, and one slip away from a fall that would turn her into the very product she spent 10 hours a day processing. The technician she had trusted stood behind the guards, his eyes cold as he radioed for an unmarked van to pull up to the loading dock. Eva realized then that she wasn't just fighting for her job or her life. She was a witness to a crime so profitable that the company was willing to make her disappear to keep the gears turning. "Who did you send to my house, Miller?" she screamed. But the only answer was the relentless, indifferent thrum of the machines. The ammonia burned her throat with every breath, sharp and metallic, like licking a battery. Eva's fingers slipped on the wet carcass, the raw meat slick under her gloves, the stench of blood and guts clinging to her skin. The conveyor belt groaned, a relentless metal beast, spitting out another side of beef before she'd even finished the last. Her shoulders screamed, but she didn't slow down. Couldn't. The foreman's whistle shrilled again, a sound that made her teeth clench. This was the rhythm of prairie pride, a cadence of industrial slaughter that demanded everything and gave back only exhaustion. Eva monitored the line with a hawk's intensity, her eyes tracking the rhythmic sway of the hooks. The speed had been dialed up again. She could hear it in the high-pitched whine of the motors, a sound that set her nerves on edge. Every motion had to be surgical, every cut precise, yet the pace forced a frantic sloppiness that tasted like fear. She wiped a smear of fat from her visor, her breath coming in ragged hitches. The air was a thick, humid soup of organic decay and chemical sanitizers, a mixture that seemed to coat the inside of her lungs in a layer of grime that no amount of coughing could dislodge. Ahead, the line stuttered. A half-butchered cow had wedged itself between the hooks, its weight dragging the belt to a crawl. The men behind her cursed, their voices raw with frustration, the sound of their anger lost in the mechanical roar. Eva wiped her sleeve across her forehead, the fabric coming away damp with sweat and grime. She stepped forward, her boots squelching in the blood-slicked floor, and grabbed the carcass by the haunch. The meat was still warm, the fat clinging to her gloves like wax. She braced her feet, feeling the vibration of the stalled motor through the soles of her boots. It was a dangerous game, reaching into the guts of the machine while it hummed with frustrated energy. But the alternative was Miller's wrath. She shoved her shoulder against the cold, dead weight, her muscles bunching. The carcass was a stubborn anchor, snagged on a jagged piece of metal that shouldn't have been there. "Move it, Martinez." Miller's voice cut through the din, thick with impatience. He loomed over her from the raised walkway, his face flushed, the veins in his neck standing out like ropes. He didn't look at the jam. He looked at his stopwatch. "You think we got all day? You're killing the numbers." Eva gritted her teeth and heaved. She didn't look up at him, knowing that meeting his eyes would only invite more bile. The carcass shifted, but the belt jerked forward with a violent, mechanical sob, nearly yanking her off her feet. Her knees buckled, but she locked them, bracing against the weight. The men behind her muttered, their breath hot on her neck. One of them, Rico maybe, spat on the floor, the sound wet and disgusting against the concrete. Ava felt the heat of the machinery radiating against her skin, a reminder of the sheer force contained within the steel. She dug her fingers deeper into the meat, her nails biting into the fat through the thin latex of her gloves. The belt lurched again, a sickening metal-on-metal screech echoing through the rafters. And this time, the carcass gave way, with a wet, heavy thud. She stumbled back, her boots skidding in the blood, and barely caught herself on the safety rail. The line roared back to life, the hook swinging with renewed, vengeful speed. As the rhythm resumed its frantic pulse, Ava noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. Near the primary intake valves, the safety housings were stripped bare. Instead of the heavy steel pins required by the manual, the valves were held in place by thick, industrial zip ties, bright neon plastic that looked absurd against the rusted iron. They were strained to the point of turning white, the plastic stretching under the pressure of the accelerated line. She moved closer, dodging a swinging ribcage, her eyes narrowing. It wasn't just one. Every single backup release on this section had been bypassed. The company hadn't just ignored the maintenance. They had actively sabotaged the safety protocols to keep the gears turning. She looked up at Miller, who was already turning away to bark at a forklift driver. Ava stepped off the line, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She marched toward the stairs, her boots echoing with a hollow metallic ring. "Miller," she shouted, her voice raspy from the ammonia. He stopped, his shoulders tensing, and turned slowly. "Get back to your station, Martinez," he warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The valves," she said, pointing a shaking, gore-stained finger toward the intake. "You zip-tied the safety releases. That's a death trap, Miller. If that line surges, those ties won't hold. The whole thing will blow." Miller stepped down the stairs, invading her space until she could smell the burnt sugar scent of his cheap cologne. He didn't look at the valves. He looked at her like she was a bug he was considering crushing. "I don't remember asking for an engineering report from a floor drudge," he sneered. "Those ties are a temporary measure to ensure we hit the morning quota. You want to keep your job? You want to keep that little girl of yours in shoes? Then you shut your mouth and you move the meat. It's illegal," Ava whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a cold, rising fury. "Shut it down. Shut it down now before someone gets killed." Miller's hand shot out, grabbing her upper arm and shoving her back toward the conveyor. The force was enough to make her teeth jar. "Nobody's getting killed except your career if you don't get back to work. Now." He turned his back on her, a gesture of supreme, arrogant indifference, and signaled the control booth to increase the torque. Ava watched him go, her hand instinctively moving to the scar on her thumb. The air felt heavier now, charged with a static tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. Tomas was working 20 feet down line, his gnarled hands moving with the practiced grace of a man who had survived 30 years in the belly of the beast. He saw the exchange and caught Eva's eye, a grim shadow of concern crossing his weathered face. He knew. He had seen the zip ties too, but he had a son's medical bills and a mortgage that didn't care about safety codes. He turned back to the hydraulic press, a massive yellow-framed monster that flattened the offal for rendering. The press was cycling faster than it ever had, the hiss of the hydraulics sounding like the breath of a dying giant. A heavy chunk of bone had wedged itself in the corner of the compression plate, threatening to crack the seal. Thomas reached in. He relied on the infrared sensors, the invisible curtain of light that was supposed to kill the power the moment a human hand crossed the threshold. But the sensors had been taped over with duct tape, another temporary measure, to prevent the line from stopping every time a stray piece of fat flew through the air. Eva saw it happen in slow motion. The press didn't stop. It didn't hesitate. The heavy steel plate descended with a rhythmic, indifferent thud. A scream tore through the mechanical roar, a sound so raw and primal it seemed to vibrate the very floorboards. Thomas was on his knees, his arm disappearing into the maw of the yellow machine. The industrial floor erupted. Workers dropped their knives, the clatter of steel on the concrete sounding like rain. "Stop the line!" Eva shrieked, lunging for the emergency kill switch near the podium. But the switch didn't move. It was jammed, or perhaps it too had been bypassed. The machinery continued to roar, the press cycling again, indifferent to the flesh and bone caught in its teeth. Thomas collapsed into shock, his face turning a sickly shade of gray, his eyes rolling back. Blood, dark and arterial, began to spray across the pristine stainless steel of the workstation. "Get back! Move back!" The shouts didn't come from the workers, but from the black-clad security guards who seemed to materialize from the shadows of the loading docks. They didn't go for Thomas. They didn't reach for first aid kits. They formed a human wall, their heavy boots thudding against the wet floor, pushing the horrified onlookers away from the mangled machine. "Help him!" Eva screamed, trying to shove past a guard whose neck was as thick as a tree trunk. "He's bleeding out. Call an ambulance." The guard didn't speak. He shoved his forearm into Eva's chest, pinning her back. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw another guard snatch a cell phone out of a young worker's hand and smash it onto the concrete. They weren't managing an accident. They were managing a crime scene, ensuring no digital record of the bypassed sensors could leave the building. The rage that had been simmering in Eva's gut for years finally boiled over. She wasn't 16 anymore, watching her father's factory burn. She was a mother, a worker, a witness. As the guard reached for her shoulder to haul her toward the exit, Eva spun. She grabbed the heavy metal toolkit sitting on a nearby bench, a massive box filled with wrenches and heavy steel rods, and heaved it with every ounce of strength she possessed. It hit the floor directly in the path of the advancing security line, the heavy tools spilling out in a chaotic, clattering mess. The guards stumbled, their heavy boots slipping on the rolling wrenches and the slick blood. In that momentary vacuum of chaos, Eva didn't run for the door. She ran for the supervisor's podium. It was a raised glass box, the nerve center of the floor. Miller was there, frantically barking into a radio, his back to the door. On the desk lay the maintenance log, the thick, leather-bound binder where every bypass, every repair, and every temporary measure was supposed to be recorded. She lunged. Her fingers closed around the cold cover of the log. It was wet, stained with a spray of Thomas's blood that had reached all the way to the glass. She tucked it under her arm, the weight of it feeling like a weapon. Miller turned, his eyes widening in shock, but Eva was already moving. She vaulted over the railing, her boots hitting the floor with a jarring impact, and disappeared into the steam rising from the rendering vats. She found herself in the shadows behind the locker room, her breath coming in jagged gasps. Sarah was there, standing by the medical supply cabinet, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Sarah," Eva hissed, clutching the log to her chest. "I need the key. Thomas is dying out there. I need the trauma kit, the tourniquets, and you have to hide this. They're looking for it." Sarah looked at the blood on Eva's clothes, then at the heavy binder. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass key to the cabinet. Her blue eyes were wide, blinking rapidly, the telltale sign of a lie in progress. "Eva, you shouldn't have taken that. Miller, he's losing his mind. Hide it, Sarah, please." Eva shoved the log toward her friend, but Sarah stepped back, her hands raised as if the book were on fire. "I can't," Sarah whispered. She didn't open the cabinet. Instead, she tucked the key deep into her apron pocket and looked over Eva's shoulder toward the hallway, where the heavy thud of security boots was growing louder. She didn't meet Eva's eyes. She raised a hand and pointed, a silent signal to the men emerging from the gloom. "She's here. Miller, she's right here." The betrayal cut deeper than any blade. Eva didn't wait to argue. She spun and dived into the narrow gap between the lockers just as the first guard rounded the corner. She realized then that the bonus checks and the fear of poverty had turned Sarah into something else, a part of the machine. The plant didn't stop for the blood. It never did. By the time the sun began to set over the Nebraska plains, the announcement came over the intercom, cold and mechanical. The facility was entering a 24-hour lockdown. "Preparation for the board of directors," the voice droned. But everyone knew the truth. They were being scrubbed. Eva was cornered in the deserted locker room 2 hours later. Miller didn't come with guards this time. He came alone, his face a mask of cold, bureaucratic malice. He held a tablet in his hand, the screen glowing with a sickly blue light. "You've been busy, Martinez," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "It seems someone deleted the week's digital safety records from the central server. Sabotage is a federal offense in a food processing facility. I have 3 witnesses who say they saw you at the terminal." "You're lying," Eva said, her back against a dented locker. "You deleted them to cover for Thomas. It doesn't matter what I did," Miller said, stepping closer. "What matters is the report I just finished filing. You see, a woman who commits industrial sabotage and spends her days in a high-risk environment isn't exactly Mother of the Year material. I've already called Child Protective Services. They'll be at your apartment by morning to pick up your daughter. Unless, of course, that maintenance log finds its way back to my desk in the next 5 minutes." The world tilted. The thought of her daughter in a cold government office, wondering why her mother hadn't come home, was a physical blow. Eva's hand went to her scarred thumb, rubbing the jagged skin. She felt a wave of nausea, the coppery taste of fear filling her mouth. "You wouldn't," she breathed. "Try me," Miller countered. He checked his watch. "The clock is ticking, Eva. Give me the book, and maybe I call my friend at the agency and tell him it was all a misunderstanding. Don't, and you'll never see her again." He left her there, shaking in the dim light. Eva knew she couldn't give him the log. It was the only thing keeping Tomas's death from being a footnote. But she needed to know what he had told the agency. She waited for the shift change, the moment of relative chaos when the skeleton crew took over. She moved like a ghost through the corridors, her boots silent on the concrete. She reached the HR office, her heart hammered against her ribs. The door was a heavy slab of oak, dead-bolted from the inside. She reached for the handle, her mind racing for a way to pick the lock. But before her fingers could touch the cold metal, a sharp, mechanical click echoed through the hallway. It was the sound of a deadbolt sliding home. But no one was in the hall. Someone was inside, watching her through the security feed, mocking her. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The rendering wing was plunged into a thick, suffocating darkness. The only light came from the distant, hellish orange glow of the furnaces on the floor below, casting long, skeletal shadows across the rows of hanging beef carcasses. Eva stood frozen. The silence was worse than the noise, a heavy, expectant quiet that tasted of ozone. A footstep, not the heavy thud of a guard, but a soft, rhythmic scuff. From behind a meat trolley, a figure emerged. He wore a janitor's uniform, but he moved with the coiled tension of a predator. In his hand, a tactical knife caught the dim orange light, a sliver of silver in the gloom. He didn't speak. He lunged. Eva threw herself to the side, the blade whistling past her ear and slicing into a hanging side of beef with a wet thwack. She scrambled back, her hands searching the darkness for a weapon. Her fingers closed around a heavy steel sharpening rod left on a butcher's block. The cleaner came at her again, his movements precise and lethal. He wasn't a janitor. He was a professional, a shadow hired to erase the last witness. Eva parried the first strike, the metal rod clanging against the knife with a shower of sparks. The vibration jarred her teeth, but she didn't let go. She used the environment, ducking behind the swinging carcasses, using the cold, dead weight of the meat as a shield. They danced a brutal ballet in the dark. Eva was smaller, faster, fueled by a desperation that the assassin couldn't match. She saw her opening near the cold storage unit, a massive walk-in freezer with a heavy, insulated door. She feigned a stumble, drawing him in. As he lunged for the kill, she swung the sharpening rod with everything she had, catching him in the ribs. He gasped, his momentum carrying him forward. Eva shoved him, her shoulder hitting his chest, and sent him stumbling back into the freezing vault. She slammed the door. The heavy latch clicked into place, and she spun the external locking wheel until it groaned. The muffled thuds from inside the door were the only sound in the wing. She leaned against the cold steel, her breath coming in ragged sobs. She needed to move. She followed a secondary power line, looking for the source of the accelerated speed. In a restricted maintenance alcove, she found it. A hidden, experimental motor, twice the size of the standard units, bolted to the main drive. It was a raw, unfinished piece of machinery, vibrating with a violent frequency. There were no emergency brakes, no manual overrides. It was built for one thing: speed at any cost. Nearby, a discarded technical manual lay in the dirt. Eva flipped through the pages, her eyes widening. Prairie Pride wasn't just processing meat. They were a testing ground. The manual detailed a partnership with a global logistics firm to test ultra-high-speed processing technology. The immigrant workforce wasn't just labor. They were the stress test variables. Tomas hadn't been an accident. He had been a data point. The grief she had been holding back vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline rage. They had broken Thomas to see how far the steel could bend. Martinez. The voice boomed through the basement stairwell. Miller. He didn't wait for her to run. He was on her in seconds, his hand gripping her hair and dragging her toward the breaker room. He threw her inside, the smell of ozone and burnt wire thick in the air. He held up his phone, showing her a grainy, real-time photo. It was her daughter, Sophia, standing by the school gates. A black SUV was idling just feet away. "One more step, Eva," Miller hissed, his face inches from hers. "One more investigation, and she gets in that car. You'll be facing 20 years for industrial espionage. I'll make sure the court sees you as a terrorist. Give me the log." "I don't have it," she spat, her voice a jagged edge. "Then you have nothing." Miller turned to the breaker panel and slammed a lever. The lights in the wing above died. "I'm cutting the grid. You're trapped down here until the board arrives. Then you disappear." He locked the door, leaving her in the humming darkness of the electrical room. Eva slumped against the wall, the weight of the world crushing her. But then, a voice. "Eva, it's Leo." A sympathetic technician, a man who had always shared his coffee with Thomas, appeared at the small reinforced window. "I saw what he did. I can't let this happen. I can disable the security grid for 5 minutes. If you can get to the master server in the rafters, You can upload everything to the outside world. There's a satellite link that management uses. Why help me now? She asked, her voice hollow. Because Thomas was my friend too, Leo whispered. Go, now, through the ventilation duct. Eva climbed. She pushed through the cramped, dusty shafts until she emerged on the narrow service ladders high above the killing floor. The gratings were slick with condensation, vibrating with the roar of the machines below. She moved like a shadow, her heart in her throat, dodging the sweeping beams of the guards' flashlights. She reached the high-altitude workstation, the master server humming like a hive of angry bees. She pulled out her phone, ready to transmit the photos she had taken of the zip-tied valves and the experimental motor. I'm here, Leo, she whispered into her radio. Good. Leo's voice crackled back, but the tone had changed. It was flat, devoid of emotion. Now stay right there. A silent alarm began to pulse, a rhythmic red glow that bathed the rafters in the color of blood. Leo appeared on the catwalk below, but he wasn't alone. He held a high-powered flashlight, the beam pinning Eva like a moth to a card. He wasn't a friend. He was the bait. She's on the north rail, Leo shouted. Security guards swarmed the catwalks from both ends. Eva was trapped, the safety railing the only thing between her and a 40-foot drop into the grinders. She looked down at the churning blades and felt a surge of vertigo. Give us the phone, Martinez. Miller's voice echoed from the floor below. Eva didn't surrender. She kicked a heavy steam pipe, the rusted valve snapping under her boot. A blinding cloud of scalding vapor erupted, filling the rafters. In the confusion, she scrambled past the first guard, her hands burning on the hot metal. She ran blindly across the narrow beams, the screams of the guards lost in the mechanical roar. A guard lunged from the mist, his weight slamming into her. Eva stumbled, her feet skidding on the slick grate. She reached out to steady herself, but her phone, her only proof, slipped from her sweat-slicked palm. She watched in slow motion as it tumbled through the air, falling straight into a massive vat of boiling organic waste. A wet plop, and it was gone. The acidic sludge consumed it in seconds. Eva stared at the vat, her knees hitting the metal grating. It was over. The photos, the videos, the evidence, all dissolved in the waste. The guards surrounded her, their faces illuminated by the red emergency lights. They were laughing. Miller stepped onto the catwalk, his smile a jagged wound in the dark. Bruised, defeated, and empty-handed, Miller mocked. You really thought you could win? They hauled her down to the loading dock. An unmarked corporate van was waiting, its engine idling. The board of directors was arriving, a fleet of luxury cars pulling into the front lot. Eva saw the CEO, a man in a suit that cost more than she made in a year, stepping out with a polished plastic smile. Process her at the off-site facility, Miller ordered, shoving her toward the van. Make her disappear. Eva looked back at the plant, the dark, towering walls, feeling like the headstone of her life. She was shoved into a windowless holding room, the heavy steel door slamming shut with a finality that broke her spirit. She slumped onto the floor, the smell of disinfectant and fear choking her. But then she saw it, a flickering overhead light. The wiring was exposed, a mess of outdated copper and frayed insulation. She knew this plant. She had spent a decade fixing what the company wouldn't. This room shared a wall with the main power hub. She reached into her hair and pulled out a metal clip. From the corner of the room, she grabbed a discarded radio, its battery leaking a sticky, acidic fluid. She didn't have a phone, but she had the soul of a mechanic. She stripped the wires with her teeth, the taste of copper and salt filling her mouth. She created a high-voltage bridge, her hands shaking. "For Thomas," she whispered. She jammed the clip into the electronic lock's housing. A violent spark erupted, the smell of ozone filling the room. The lock groaned, the magnets failing as the power surged. The door popped open with a sharp crack. She didn't run for the exit. She crawled through the ventilation ducts, following the rhythmic thumping of the illegal motor. She reached the floor, moving through the shadows until she stood before Tomas's old workstation. The base of the machine was hollow, a secret spot where he used to hide his cigarettes. She reached inside. Her fingers closed around the cold, damp leather of the maintenance log. She hadn't lost it. She had hidden the physical truth where they would never think to look, in the blood of the man they had broken. On the observation deck, the CEO was beginning his speech. "Safety is our priority," he purred to the investors. "Prairie Pride is a family." Ava reached the master fire pull station. She didn't hesitate. She smashed the glass with the butt of the log and pulled. The emergency shutdown was absolute. The $1 million line ground to a violent, screaming halt. The lights died, plunging the boardroom into a deafening silence. Ava burst through the double doors, disheveled, bruised, and covered in the grime of the ducts. She held the gore-streaked log high above her head. "You want to talk about family?" she shouted, her voice echoing in the sudden quiet. She flings the blood-stained pages onto the mahogany table, directly in front of the CEO. The investors recoiled, their faces masks of horror as they looked at the signatures on the safety bypass memos. Signatures that bore the CEO's personal seal. "He signed them," Eva said, pointing at the man in the silver suit. "He authorized the zip ties. He authorized the motors that crushed Thomas Rivera's arm." The CEO tried to laugh, to dismiss her as a madwoman, but the lead investor was already holding one of the pages, his face turning pale. "This is your seal, Arthur. These dates, they match the production surge." Miller burst in with the police, his face twisted in a snarl. "Arrest her! Trespassing! Sabotage!" The officers moved in, clicking the cuffs around Eva's wrists. She didn't fight them. She stood tall, her eyes locked on the investors who were now holding up their own phones, recording the CEO's panicked stuttering and the blood on the documents. In the back of the room, Sarah stood by the power console. Miller screamed at her to restart the line, to flip the switch and hide the silence. Sarah looked at Eva, then at the empty station where Thomas should have been. She took a breath, her blue eyes clear and still. "No," she said, her voice small but firm. "I won't." One by one, the other workers stepped away from the machines. A silent blockade, a forest of tired, angry people. The plant stayed dark. Ava was led out into the morning sunlight. The air was cool and sweet, the scent of the plains finally drowning out the ammonia. She saw the workers walking out in solidarity, a slow, unstoppable tide of humanity. She had no job. She had a court date. But as she looked at the sun rising over the horizon, Eva Martinez felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She had traded a paycheck for a soul. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid.